In the dusty town of Redstone, under a blazing sun, proud cowboy Jack Morton decided to put on a show by humiliating poor farmer Amos Reed right on the main street. At high noon, with the saloon crowd watching every move, Jack shoved Amos into the dirt with a smug grin, sparking loud laughter from the onlookers. But that brief moment of triumph kicked off a tale where fate's irony, honor, and revenge would tangle tightly. The crowd's look shifted, and Jack, unaware, set off a chain of events that would test him to the core. Here's how it all began. Hey, listener, how's it going? Where you tuning in from? The small town of Redstone baked under the relentless midday sun. Horses snorted at the water trough, their tails swishing flies away, while the saloon's swinging doors creaked with every drunken stumble. Dust hung in the air, coating boots and faces, and the faint clink of spurs mixed with the low murmur of card players hunched over a table inside. Jack Morton, the town's self-proclaimed top dog, strode down the main street, his black hat tilted just so, his Colt revolver glinting at his hip. He was a man who thrived on eyes following him, and today he felt the weight of every stare. Jack's reputation wasn't built on kindness. He was the guy who'd outdrawn Billy Klein in a duel last spring, the one who'd sent 3 rustlers running with their tails between their legs. But he wasn't all heroics. Jack had a mean streak, a knack for picking fights just to hear the crowd cheer. Today, his eyes locked on a scrawny farmer named Amos Reed, who was tying his mule outside the general store. Amos was nobody special. Patched-up overalls, a straw hat frayed at the edges, and a face weathered by years of breaking his back for meager crops. Jack saw an easy target, a chance to remind Redstone who ruled the roost. "Got a problem with the heat, farmer?" Jack called out, his voice loud enough to turn heads. Amos glanced up, squinting against the sun, but said nothing, just kept tying the knot. That silence irked Jack. He sauntered closer, boots kicking up dust, and the crowd outside the saloon started to gather, sensing a show. "I'm talking to you, dirt scraper. You deaf or just dumb?" Jack's grin was all teeth, and a few men chuckled, egging him on. Amos straightened, meeting Jack's gaze, but still held his tongue. Jack didn't like being ignored. He stepped forward, chest puffed out, and shoved Amos hard. The farmer stumbled, his hat flying off as he hit the dirt with a thud. The crowd roared with laughter, a few clapping like it was a damn theater performance. Jack stood over Amos, hands on his hips, soaking in the noise. "Stay down where you belong," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Some folks hooted, others whistled, but a few, mostly the older ones, the shopkeep and the blacksmith, exchanged looks, their faces tightening. Whispers started, quiet but sharp, about Jack going too far, about picking on a man who didn't deserve it. Amos didn't move for a moment, just lay there in the dust, his hands gripping the ground. Then, slowly, he pushed himself up, brushing off his overalls like nothing had happened. He didn't say a word, didn't even look at Jack again. He just picked up his hat, dusted it off, and walked into the store. The crowd's laughter died down, replaced by an awkward hum of murmurs. Jack, still grinning, tipped his hat to the onlookers and sauntered toward the saloon, thinking he'd won the day. But those whispers, those sidelong glances, they were the first cracks in the pedestal he'd built for himself. The sun still burned over Redstone, casting long shadows as the crowd outside the general store thinned out. Jack Morton had already swaggered off to the saloon, his laughter echoing in the dusty air, leaving Amos Reed alone in the street. The farmer knelt briefly, retrieving his worn straw hat from the dirt, his hands steady despite the humiliation. A few townsfolk lingered, their eyes flicking between curiosity and discomfort, but no one offered a hand. Amos didn't seem to expect one either. He stood, brushed the dust from his overalls, and fixed his gaze on the store's entrance, ignoring the faint murmurs around him. That look in Amos's eyes wasn't anger or shame. It was something harder, like steel tempered in a forge. He adjusted his hat, squared his shoulders, and walked into the store as if Jack's shove had been nothing more than a gust of wind. Inside, the shopkeep, Old Man Hargrove, watched him enter, his usual chatter about grain prices falling silent. Amos nodded politely, asked for a sack of flour, and paid with coins pulled from a frayed pocket. The whole exchange was quiet, deliberate, and oddly commanding, like Amos carried a weight no one could quite name. Back outside, the street buzzed with whispers. A couple of saloon regulars, still chuckling, reenacted Jack's shove for anyone who'd listen, but others weren't so amused. The blacksmith, wiping sweat from his brow, muttered to a passerby about Jack's need to pick on someone his own size. A woman fetching water shook her head, saying it wasn't right to kick a man already down. The mood was shifting, subtle but real, like a cloud passing over the sun. Jack's stunt, meant to cement his place as Redstone's big shot, had instead planted a seed of doubt. Amos, meanwhile, emerged from the store, flour sack slung over his shoulder. He didn't glance at the saloon where Jack's voice boomed, bragging about his latest triumph. The farmer just untied his mule, gave it a gentle pat, and started down the street, his steps slow but sure. Those who saw him pass noticed something. Not defiance, not weakness, but a quiet resolve that made the air feel heavier. The crowd's earlier laughter had faded, replaced by an uneasy silence, as if they sensed a storm brewing. Jack, oblivious, kept drinking inside the saloon, toasting to his own legend. He didn't see the glances exchanged outside, didn't hear the whispers questioning his bravado. Amos's calm, unshaken response had done more than any fistfight could. It had turned the town's eyes inward, and Jack's pedestal was starting to wobble. The farmer had planted a seed of his own, one that would grow in the days ahead, whether Jack liked it or not. The sun had dipped below Redstone's horizon, leaving the saloon aglow with flickering lanterns and the hum of evening chatter. Inside, the air smelled of stale whiskey and sweat, with card tables crowded and glasses clinking. Jack Morton held court near the bar, his boots propped on a chair, recounting his afternoon triumph over Amos Reed to anyone within earshot. His voice carried over the piano's tinny notes, boasting about how the farmer ate dust and how Redstone would talk about it for weeks. A few men laughed, raising their drinks, but the room wasn't as unified as Jack thought. At a corner table, two ranch hands leaned close, their voices low. One, a wiry man named Clem, smirked and said, "Jack's got a big mouth, but that farmer didn't flinch. Takes guts to walk away like that." His buddy nodded, sipping his beer, and added, "Ain't right, pushing a man down for sport. Jack's acting like he owns this town." Their words weren't loud, but they spread, like ripples in a pond, reaching other tables. A woman pouring drinks nearby rolled her eyes, muttering about Jack's need to prove something every damn day. The barman, a grizzled fellow named Hank with a knack for reading the room, polished a glass and watched the scene unfold. He'd seen Jack pull stunts before, fistfights, quick draws, loud threats, but this felt different. The crowd wasn't all cheers and claps anymore. When Jack called for another round, Hank slid a whiskey his way and said, "Slaughterin' a man's pride don't buy you glory, Jack." Might cost you more'n you think. Jack laughed it off, slapping the bar, but the words hung there, sharp as a spur. Across the room, a group of older townsfolk, the blacksmith, a seamstress, and a store clerk, traded glances. They didn't say much, but their silence spoke volumes. One whispered that Amos Reed had never caused trouble, always paid his debts, and didn't deserve Jack's cruelty. Another mentioned how Jack's swagger was starting to feel like a show gone on too long. The saloon, usually a place of rowdy agreement, was splitting into factions, those who still saw Jack as a hero and those who saw a bully overplaying his hand. Jack didn't notice the shift. He kept talking, kept drinking, blind to the way the room's energy had turned. For him, the day was a win, another notch on his belt. But for Redstone, it was a spark, a story growing legs. The whispers weren't just gossip, they were the town's judgment taking shape, and Jack was about to learn that laughter could cut both ways. The saloon's lanterns cast a dim glow as the night deepened in Redstone, the air thick with tobacco smoke and the clatter of glasses. Jack Morton leaned against the bar, his hat pushed back, still riding the high of his earlier stunt. The crowd had thinned, leaving a mix of drunks and card players, their laughter more subdued now. Jack was mid-story, spinning a tale about outsmarting a cattle rustler when the saloon doors swung open. Amos Reed stepped inside, his patched overalls and steady gait drawing every eye in the room. No one expected the farmer to show up here, least of all Jack. Amos didn't look for trouble, didn't even glance Jack's way. He walked to the bar a few feet from the cowboy and ordered a whiskey in a voice calm as a still pond. The barman, Hank, raised an eyebrow but poured the drink without comment. Amos took the glass, sipped it slowly, and stared at the bottles lining the wall, like Jack wasn't even there. The room went quiet, the piano player missing a note as folks waited for something, anything, to happen. Jack's grin faltered. He couldn't let this slide, not with eyes on him. "Didn't figure you for a drinking man, farmer," he said loud enough to pull attention. Amos turned his head, meeting Jack's gaze with that same unyielding look from the street. "A man's got a right to a drink after a long day," Amos replied, his tone even, no trace of anger. The words were simple, but they landed like a stone in the silence, heavy and deliberate. The crowd stirred, a few smirks breaking out. One ranch hand chuckled, muttering to his friend, "Farmer's got more spine than Jack figured." Jack's jaw tightened, his hand hovering near his glass, not his gun. He tried to laugh, tossing out, "Takes more'n whiskey to wash off dirt, Reed." But Amos just sipped again, unbothered, and turned back to the bar. That calm, that refusal to bite, hit Jack harder than any insult could. The saloon buzzed with low whispers, some amused, others sharp with judgment. Hank leaned forward, wiping the bar, and said to no one in particular, "Some men fight with fists, others with silence. Guess we'll see who wins." The comment wasn't aimed at Jack, but it stung all the same. As Amos finished his drink and left, the room's mood shifted again. Jack's bravado felt hollow now, and the crowd's quiet snickers followed him like shadows. Amos hadn't thrown a punch, but he'd landed a blow, and Redstone was starting to pick sides. Redstone woke to a morning thick with heat, the kind that made tempers flare and dust stick to sweaty skin. The main street hummed with its usual rhythm, wagons creaking, shopkeepers sweeping porches, but the talk of the town had shifted. Jack Morton's name was on everyone's lips, not for his quick draw or barroom bravado, but for the way he'd pushed Amos Reed into the dirt. By noon, the story had grown, twisted by retellings, and Jack's triumph was starting to sound like a misstep. At the general store, a group of townsfolk lingered, trading stories over barrels of grain. A wiry stable hand, wiping his hands on a rag, grinned and said, "Old Jack thought he'd play king, but that farmer made him look like a fool without saying a word." The seamstress nearby laughed, adding, "Takes a big man to shove a small one, don't it?" Her sarcasm drew chuckles, and the shopkeep, Hargrove, shook his head, muttering about pride coming before a fall. These weren't loud declarations, but they spread, each jab chipping away at Jack's carefully built image. Jack felt the shift as he walked through town. Men who'd once slapped his back now gave half smiles, their eyes dodging his. At the saloon, a regular named Pete, usually quick with a cheer, leaned over his beer and said, "Jack, you ever think about picking a fight worth winning?" The words were light, but they cut deep, and the snickers from nearby tables made Jack's neck burn. He forced a grin, tossing back, "Ain't no fight I can't win, Pete." But the room didn't roar with approval like it used to. By afternoon, the jokes had legs. A kid outside the blacksmith shop mimicked Jack's swagger, pretending to shove an imaginary farmer, earning laughs from passers-by. Even the saloon's piano player, banging out a tune, slipped in a mocking lyric about a cowboy who tripped on his own spurs. Jack overheard it from the bar, his fingers tightening around his glass. He wanted to yell, to draw his gun and silence the room, but he knew that'd only make it worse. The town wasn't just laughing at the incident now, they were laughing at him. Every whispered jab, every sly grin, poked at his pride like a thorn. Jack's temper simmered, but he held it in, not ready to admit the farmer's silence had outdone his noise. Redstone was watching, waiting to see if he'd double down or crack, and for the first time, Jack felt the weight of eyes that weren't cheering. Redstone's streets buzzed with the usual clatter of hooves and chatter, but a new undercurrent ran through the town. Jack Morton, once the man who could hush a room with a glance, now felt the sting of sidelong looks and muffled laughs. The saloon, his usual haunt, was no longer a safe throne. By midday he sat at a card table, his hat low to hide the tension in his jaw, determined to claw back the respect he could feel slipping away. The air smelled of stale beer and dust, and every creak of the floorboards seemed to carry a whisper of his name. Jack joined a poker game, tossing coins into the pot with a forced grin. He'd always been sharp with cards, reading faces as easily as he read trails. But today, his luck was sour. He bet big on a weak hand, only to lose to a quiet rancher who barely looked up from his cards. "Better luck next time, Morton," the rancher said, scooping the coins, his tone just shy of mocking. The table chuckled and Jack's smile tightened. He tried another round, doubling down, but lost again, this time to a kid barely old enough to shave. The kid's grin was too wide, the room's laughter too sharp. Later, Jack stepped outside to the shooting range behind the blacksmith's, figuring a show of skill would quiet the snickers. He lined up bottles, his Colt steady in his hand, but his first shot clipped the edge, sending glass spinning instead of shattering. The small crowd, a few loafers and a shop boy, didn't cheer like they used to. One muttered, "Guess even Jack's aim's off these days." Jack fired again, hitting true, but the applause was thin, replaced by a smirk from a passing stable hand who said, "Heard the farmer don't need a gun to make a point." By evening, Jack's name was a punchline. In the saloon, a drunk retold the story of Amos Reed's calm whiskey sip, adding, "Takes a real man to stand tall without swingin'." The words weren't meant for Jack, but they found him, sitting alone at the bar. Even his usual drinking buddies, men who'd once bought him rounds, kept their distance, their laughs now aimed at him instead of with him. Hank, the barman, polished a glass and said, "Folks like a hero, Jack, not a show-off." Town's got a long memory. Jack's pride burned, each joke a spark on dry grass. He wasn't ready to face Amos again, not yet, but the town's shift was undeniable. Redstone no longer saw a legend. They saw a man who'd overplayed his hand, and the weight of their judgment was heavier than any gunfight. The midday sun scorched Redstone's main street, turning the dust to a gritty haze that clung to everything. Jack Morton stood outside the general store, his hat tilted low, trying to shake off the sting of the town's growing mockery. His boots scuffed the dirt as he paced, each step heavier with the weight of whispers that followed him like flies. The saloon's laughter from last night still echoed in his head, and he needed to set things right. Then, across the street he saw Amos Reed tying his mule to a post, calm as ever, like the whole town wasn't buzzing about him. Jack's blood ran hot. He crossed the street in long strides, the clink of his spurs drawing eyes from shopkeepers and passers-by. "Hey, farmer," he called, his voice sharp enough to cut through the midday hum. Amos turned, his face steady, no trace of fear. "You got something to say after that stunt in the saloon?" Jack stopped a few feet away, hands on his hips, his Colt a quiet threat at his side. The crowd gathered slowly, sensing another showdown, but their murmurs weren't cheering Jack on this time. Amos adjusted his straw hat, meeting Jack's glare. "Ain't got much to say, Morton." A man's actions speak louder than his mouth. His words were slow, deliberate, like he was stating a fact about the weather. The crowd stirred, a few nodding, others whispering. Jack's jaw clenched. He stepped closer, voice dropping. "You think you're better than me, Reed? Hiding behind that quiet act don't make you a man." But Amos didn't flinch, just looked at him, his eyes calm but piercing, like he saw right through Jack's bluster. A shop boy snickered, and an older woman muttered, "Jack's digging his own grave now." The crowd's mood had turned, their faces showing more curiosity about Amos than loyalty to Jack. Jack tried again, louder. "This town knows who runs things, and it ain't some dirt farmer." But the words fell flat, like a shot missing its mark. Amos gave a slight, almost amused smile, then turned back to his mule, dismissing Jack without a word. That tiny smirk hit harder than a fist. The street felt hotter, the air thicker, as Jack stood there, fists balled, with no one to swing at. The crowd dispersed, some chuckling, others shaking their heads. Amos walked away, his back straight, leaving Jack alone in the dust. For the first time, Jack felt Redstone slipping from his grip, and the town's eyes, once his stage, now judged him as the one out of step. Twilight settled over Redstone, painting the sky a bruised purple as the saloon filled with its usual evening crowd. Jack Morton sat at a corner table, his hat pulled low, nursing a whiskey that tasted more bitter than usual. The room hummed with chatter, but the words floating around weren't about his old victories. Instead, they carried a new nickname: the cowboy who tripped on his pride. Jack's fingers tightened on his glass, his knuckles white as he caught fragments of conversation about his street clash with Amos Reed. The town wasn't just whispering now, it was openly mocking. At the bar, a group of ranch hands swapped stories, their laughter sharp. One, a lanky man with a scarred cheek, said, "Jack thought he'd school that farmer, but Reed's the one teaching him a lesson." Another chimed in, "Ain't seen a man look so small trying to act big." The barman, Hank, didn't join the laughs, but didn't hush them either, just kept wiping glasses with a knowing smirk. Jack's name, once spoken with awe, was now a punchline, and even the drunks weren't shy about it. Jack tried to shrug it off, joining a card game to change the mood. He tossed in a bet, his voice loud with forced confidence, but the other players barely looked up. When he lost a hand to a quiet shop clerk, the man said, "Maybe you're better at shoving than playing, Morton." The table erupted in chuckles, and Jack's forced grin couldn't hide the flush creeping up his neck. He stood, muttering about a bad night, but the room's eyes followed him, not with respect, but with amusement. Outside, the street was quiet, save for a few kids reenacting Jack's failed standoff, one pretending to be Amos walking away unbothered. A passing blacksmith overheard and said, "Town's got no use for a man who fights his own shadow." The words weren't meant for Jack, but they reached him as he leaned against a post, staring at the darkening horizon. Even his old friend, Pete, who'd always had his back, passed by and said, "You're making it hard to root for you, Jack." City's watching a different hero now. The weight of Redstone's judgment pressed harder than ever. Jack's pride, once his armor, was now a noose tightening with every snicker. He knew it wasn't just Amos anymore. The whole town was the problem, waiting for him to either rise or break. And deep down, he felt the truth. His reputation wasn't just slipping, it was crumbling, and the dust of it choked him worse than the street ever could. The moon hung low over Redstone, casting a pale glow on the empty main street, where shadows stretched long and jagged. Jack Morton stood alone outside the saloon, his breath heavy with whiskey and rage. The town's laughter had gnawed at him all day, each snicker a splinter in his pride. He'd had enough. When he saw Amos Reed's mule still tied near the general store, he knew the farmer was nearby. Jack's hand rested on his Colt, his voice cutting through the night as he shouted, "Reed, get out here and face me like a man." The words echoed, pulling curious faces to windows and doorways. Amos stepped out from the store's shadow, his straw hat barely visible in the dim light. He didn't rush, didn't flinch, just walked to the center of the street, hands loose at his sides. The small crowd gathered, saloon stragglers, a shopkeep, a few ranch hands, their whispers hushed, eyes wide. Jack squared his shoulders, his voice loud but unsteady. "You've been playing me for a fool, farmer. Draw, or I'll put you in the dirt for good." The threat hung heavy, but Amos's face stayed calm, his eyes locked on Jack's, unyielding as stone. "I ain't here to fight you, Morton," Amos said, his voice steady, carrying over the quiet street. "You're fighting yourself, and everyone sees it." The words landed like a slap, sharp and final. The crowd murmured, a few nodding, others stifling laughs. Jack's hand twitched toward his gun, but Amos didn't move, didn't reach for a weapon he wasn't even carrying. That stillness, that refusal to play Jack's game, made the cowboy's blood boil. The street felt smaller, the air thicker, as eyes bore into him. A ranch hand muttered, "Farmers got more guts than guns." Another voice, from the saloon steps, added, "Jack's challenging a man who don't need to prove nothing." The crowd shift was palpable, their respect tilting toward Amos. Jack's face burned. He couldn't back down, not with Redstone watching. "You think you're above me?" he spat, stepping closer. Amos just shook his head, almost pitying. "Ain't about being above, Jack. It's about being steady." The words cut deeper than any bullet, leaving Jack frozen, his bravado crumbling under the weight of truth. The standoff ended without a shot. Amos turned, walking back to his mule, leaving Jack alone in the moonlight. The crowd dispersed, their whispers now a chorus of pity. Jack's challenge had backfired, exposing not Amos's weakness, but his own. Redstone saw it clear. The cowboy wasn't the hero anymore, and the night silence screamed louder than any gunshot. Redstone's dawn broke harsh, the sun clawing through a haze of dust that never seemed to settle. Jack Morton stood outside the saloon, his eyes bloodshot from a sleepless night, the weight of the failed duel still heavy on his shoulders. The town was waking, but its rhythm felt off. Wagons rolled slower, voices stayed low, and every glance Jack caught carried a mix of pity and scorn. His shout for Amos last night had drawn no blood, only laughter, and now Redstone saw him not as a gunslinger, but as a man unraveling. Jack tried to walk tall, heading toward the blacksmith's to pick up a repaired spur, but the street wasn't his anymore. A group of kids scattered as he approached, one mimicking his angry stride, earning giggles from a nearby shopkeeper. "Reckon Jack's dueling with ghosts now," the shopkeeper said to a passing rancher, loud enough for Jack to hear. He kept walking, jaw tight, but each step felt like wading through mud. The town's judgment wasn't just whispers anymore. It was a wall, closing in. At the saloon later, Jack ordered a drink, hoping to drown the sting. The barman, Hank, slid him a whiskey, but didn't meet his eyes. "Folks say you shot at the moon last night, Jack," Hank said, his tone half joking, half sharp. "Didn't hit it, though." A few regulars chuckled, and one, a grizzled cattle driver, added, "Takes more'n a loud voice to win a fight, Morton." Jack slammed his glass down, snapping, "I ain't finished with this town or that farmer." But the room didn't rally behind him. It just watched, amused, like he was a show gone stale. By afternoon, Jack's anger turned inward. He stood at the edge of town, staring at the endless horizon, replaying Amos's words. "You're fighting yourself." The farmer hadn't drawn a gun, hadn't thrown a punch, yet he'd won. Jack's hand hovered over his Colt, itching to reclaim his name, but he knew pulling the trigger now would only deepen the hole he'd dug. A passing woman carrying a basket muttered to her friend, "He used to be something. Now he's just loud." The town's laughter wasn't cruel, but it was relentless, stripping away the myth Jack had built. His friends, his stage, his Redstone, all had turned, leaving him alone against a crowd that no longer cheered. Amos hadn't needed to fight. He'd let Jack's own pride do the damage. And as the sun climbed higher, Jack felt the truth settle. He wasn't just losing the town, he was losing himself. The noon sun blazed over Redstone, baking the cracked earth of the main street into a gritty furnace. Jack Morton stood in the center of town, his hat askew, sweat streaking through the dust on his face. His Colt hung heavy at his hip, useless now, as the town's eyes bore into him from every porch and window. The night's failed duel had stripped away his last shred of bravado, and the whispers that once nipped at his heels had grown into a chorus of disdain. He wasn't a hero anymore. He was a spectacle, and Redstone was done cheering. Jack's legs buckled, not from a bullet or a brawl, but from the weight of his own crumbling world. He sank to his knees in the dirt, hands gripping the ground where he'd once shoved Amos Reed. The crowd gathered slowly, shopkeepers pausing their brooms, ranch hands leaning against posts, kids peeking from behind barrels. No one spoke, but their silence was louder than any gunshot. Jack's breath hitched, his voice hoarse as he muttered, "This ain't how it's supposed to be." But the words dissolved in the dry air, unanswered. Amos Reed appeared at the edge of the street, leading his mule, his face as calm as ever. He didn't gloat, didn't stop to stare, just walked past, his boots scuffing the dust, his straw hat shading eyes that held no judgment, only certainty. The crowd watched him go, some nodding, others whispering his name with a new respect. A woman near the saloon said, "That's a man who don't need to shout to be heard." Another added, "Jack broke himself, and Amos didn't lift a finger." The irony stung sharper than any blade. Jack, who'd built his name on loud victories and quick draws, had been undone by a farmer's quiet strength. The town didn't need a duel to pick a winner. They'd chosen Amos, not for fighting, but for standing firm. Jack's hands clenched the dirt, his pride shattered as a kid nearby whispered, "Thought he was king, but he's just dust now." The words weren't cruel, just true, and they cut deeper than Jack could bear. As the crowd drifted away, their murmurs fading, Jack stayed on his knees, alone in the street. Redstone moved on without him, its rhythm unbroken. Amos's shadow had outshone Jack's spotlight, and the town saw it clear. Pride could lift a man high, but it could drop him lower than the dirt he knelt in. Jack's fall wasn't just his own, it was a lesson etched into Redstone's dusty streets. Redstone shimmered under a fading sunset, the sky streaked with orange as the town settled into its evening hum. Jack Morton trudged to the edge of town, his saddlebag slung over his shoulder, his Colt still at his hip but feeling heavier than ever. The main street, once his stage, now echoed with the faint laughter of a town that had moved on. He'd fallen from hero to fool in a matter of days, and the dust on his boots felt like the weight of his own choices. Jack didn't look back as he mounted his horse and rode out, the horizon swallowing him whole. Amos Reed stayed behind, tending his mule outside the general store. The townsfolk no longer saw him as just a farmer. His name carried a quiet respect. At the saloon, Hank poured drinks and said, "Reed didn't need a gun to win, just a spine." A ranch hand nodded, adding, "Jack thought he could buy honor with fear, but this town don't work that way." The words spread, settling into Redstone's bones, a lesson carved by a man who'd stood firm without raising a fist. The streets buzzed with new stories now, not of duels or bravado, but of a farmer who'd turned a cowboy's pride against him. Women at the well spoke of Amos's calm as strength, while men at the card tables debated what makes a man. The blacksmith summed it up, hammering iron. Pride lifts you up, but honor keeps you there. Redstone had judged Jack, not with bullets, but with its collective gaze, proving that glory built on cruelty crumbles fast. Jack's departure left no void. The town carried on, its rhythm unbroken, as Amos became a quiet symbol of what mattered. No one cheered his victory. They didn't need to. His steady walk, his unshaken gaze had spoken louder than Jack's loudest boasts. Redstone learned that honor isn't won by pushing others down. It's earned by standing tall when the dust settles. And so a cowboy's fall became a farmer's rise, a story etched into the town's dusty heart. Hey listener, what'd you think of Jack's fall? Did Amos's silence hit harder than a gunshot? Where do you stand on pride versus honor? Drop your thoughts. We're curious. Thanks for riding along with us through Redstone's dusty streets. Stay tuned for more tales where fate plays its hand, and keep those spurs jingling wherever you're listening from.